Today, we're talking to a company that wants to transform the way you think about air travel. Regional travel is surprisingly difficult. San Francisco to LA, New York to Boston, New York to DC. But what all those cities have in common is they're on the coast. And 40% of the world's population lives on coasts. So, Regent is building a new type of electric aircraft for coastal regional travel, a seaglider. You can board one like a ferry in New York or Boston, take off for a quick flight at 180 miles per hour, and then land in the city next door where you can hop off at the nearest ferry terminal. They're electric, they're clean, they'll be the fastest way to travel, and they're actually cheaper than traditional aircraft alternatives. Our guests today are Billy Thalheimer and Michael Klinker, CEO and CTO of Regent. They just went through YC last winter, raised $10 million from caffeinated capital, and have just recently raised a new $18 million from Teal Capital and Jam Fund. All right, Billy, Michael, it's fantastic to have you both on the show. So what you're building at Regent is fascinating. It's a really new take on the eVTOL market in general. So what are you building at Regent?
Yeah, well, actually, we're really, I think the interesting thing is that we're not building an eVTOL. We are separating ourselves and distinguishing ourselves from the advanced air mobility and eVTOL, as in electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, by building a seaglider, which is sort of something totally new altogether. Seaglider is an all-electric hybrid between a boat and a plane that flies within a wingspan of the water at all times. So these vehicles are for dock-to-dock over water regional transportation. And when you look at the world, this is actually a huge portion of the world's travel. 40% of the people in the world live in coastal communities. Some of the most known and frankly most annoying routes in the world to travel regionally, we're talking routes like Boston, New York, LA, San Francisco. These are the routes that Regent Seagliders will access. Regional, coastal, all electric, zero emission, low cost, high speed, high comfort maritime mobility.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have done the trip from Boston to New York many times, and it is not a fun one right now. And so the idea is most of these are port cities. A sea glider will be able to go up and down the East Coast, which I think is where you're starting. And you'll be able to have essentially an alternative to airports where you won't have to go to security to the same degree. Your sea glider will actually land in a port and then ferry you to a dock, and you'll get off on like Wall Street or one of the many piers around New York City.
Yeah, really similar. The overall concept of a sea glider, the operations is called float, foil, fly. And those are the three modes we go through. So just like you were saying, our operations are based out of ports. These can be existing ferry terminals or existing boat or seaplane ports. You could also imagine building sea glider terminals at airports to enable multimodal mobility. So you could imagine flying into Boston or flying into LAX or flying into JFK and then walking to the sea glider terminal that's adjacent on that coastal airport. From there, you board the sea glider just like a ferry, so relatively low sort of infrastructure and annoyance associated with things like sort of TSA and airport security. This will be much more like boarding a ferry or a train or a bus. You just walk through a metal detector, get on board the vehicle. The sea glider will be floating there like a boat, so you get on board, strap up, and then off you go from the platform. As soon as the vehicle reaches 20 miles an hour, it'll rise up onto its hydrofoils. Hydrofoils are underwater wings. They're sort of the stilts that lift up the America's Cup racing yachts. They're also the things that, pick up these e-foil surfboards, which are a blast. But when you watch those, you can see how smooth the ride is, even in waves, how maneuverable they are. And that will be the ride comfort of the sea glider. So as we're going through harbors where there's lots of maritime traffic, we'll be on these hydrofoils. And so we'll be going sort of 20 to 40 miles an hour. We'll be very wave tolerant, very smooth, comfortable ride. And then we'll be able to sort of maneuver around the boat traffic so that there will be high degrees of safety and we won't get in the way of all sort of the rich diversity of maritime traffic that's already in the port. Once we get to the edge of the port, that's when sort of the magic starts. We take off onto our wing, always staying within a wingspan of the water surface. We're flying on this cushion of air known as ground effect. It's the same sort of cushion that you see pelicans or seagulls flying in when they're skimming the surface. We'll accelerate up to about 180 miles an hour, and we can do that because there's not much traffic out in sort of the open waters, right, when we're a mile or more away from land. We'll fly at 180 miles an hour, giving us high speed on these regional routes of, say, 100 to even 500 miles eventually. And then when we get to the opposite port, our destination, will land in the water onto our hulls. Our foils will have been retracted in flight, so we're landing on our deep V wave-piercing hull for, again, very comfortable ride, landing at the low speed of sort of 40, 45 miles an hour, about half the speed of an existing seaplane. And then once we land, we sort of do the same thing in reverse. So we redeploy our foils, we foil in through the other harbor at safe maneuverable speeds, and then we pull into the final dock just like a ferry would. So it's float, foil, fly, and then back.
Yeah, that's wild. Michael, this might be a good question for you, but why doesn't this exist yet, and why now?
Our vehicle class is a wing and ground effect vehicle, and those have been around for a long time. They really started back in the 60s when the Soviets were building these giant multi 100-ton vehicles that were fly across the Black Sea at what was like 200 miles per hour. So the type of vehicle has been around for a long time now, but it's really taken a long time to perfect it. And you see a lot, like, all the designs are old, right? No one's really applied modern aircraft design principles to the wing and ground effect vehicle. So, when you apply those principles, it changes the stability and how you fly the vehicle. But there's a lot of different technologies that are maturing right now, and really have matured over the past 20 to 30 years, that we're now trying to combine into one vehicle. So, as Billy mentioned, the hydrofoil system is really, really new and exciting, and especially for the America's Cup campaigns. Fly-by-wire control systems and digital flight controls make vehicles extremely safe and very reliable and easy to operate. And just the modern design tools we have, the CFD tools for both the aero design and the hydro design are really kind of they've all had this really cool pedigree in the past, but now we're really combining them all into one vehicle, the Seaglider.
Yeah, so I'd love to ask you about all of those, the fly-by-wire, the hydrofoil. Yep. But the other piece is that they're electric, which is one piece of the technology that you did not mention. That's actually the only piece I've heard about so far. So where does it being electric come into play? Well, at this point, I imagine it's so obvious you working on them all the time, you've probably forgot gas engines exist, but...
What is fuel, right? Electric propulsions is really it's maturing very nicely right now. The interesting thing about our team is we were all building electric aircraft at different companies. So a lot of us came from Aurora Flight Sciences, which is a Boeing subsidiary company, and we were all working on electric aviation. The technology is there to build electric aircraft, but what the challenging piece is the battery technology. Unfortunately, liquid fuel has a really high energy density, so you can fly very far with very little weight of fuel. And battery technology is kind of slowly catching up. We see the Teslas as now, able to compete with gasoline car ranges. In the aviation world, it gets a little bit harder because you need to have, if your Tesla runs out of electricity, you could stop and pull over. But if your aircraft runs out of electricity, traditionally, you got to land pretty quickly. But with our Seaglider model, you're always over the water. So we always have a safe place to land if there's a problem with the battery system, with the propulsion system, or any kind of safety related issue. We always have a very safe place to put the vehicle down and make sure that we're not in this kind of dire situation, like if you run out of power flying over, over the mountains or something.
And is this consumer, or are you moving cargo? I imagine consumer in this case might actually be kind of the highest value option for something like this.
Yes, definitely. And We're sort of building something that we want to use, right? And I think that's sort of a key unlock in why Mike and I and our whole team is so passionate is that we're solving this problem that's all near and dear to our hearts and solving regional mobility. There are certainly other uses for our vehicles in the logistics space, in tourism, in offshore energy supply. We have many different ways that you can use a sea glider, just like there's many ways you can use in aircraft. We are certainly focused on this commercial passenger mission. And that's the one that's most exciting, and that's the one where some of the key advantages of the sea glider, as in this ability to use its full battery stores, to use its full onboard electrons, as Mike was saying, is really an advantage because now we can get people on these regional routes. Whereas it's sometimes a little bit different when you think about safety or certification or stuff when you're purely focused on a cargo or potentially even autonomous cargo mission, right? The bar may be a little bit lower. Our bar for safety is still at the point where we are racing towards carrying passengers by 2025.
Yeah, the regional aspect makes a lot of sense too, in that they're not very long flights, which makes a lot of sense for electric vehicles. But also, the trip from Boston to New York is surprisingly difficult because it's a really short flight, but getting to the airport, an hour before or an hour and a half, like triples the time.
Yep.
A train is like $160 and takes like 5 hours. A bus is worse, cheaper, but worse. And like a car, I mean, you can do it if you have a car, but you got to drive for 5 hours. And it should be like a relatively short trip.
I mean, our first slide that we ever made for Regent was really like trying to capture that problem, right? There's no way to get from Boston to New York, and the airlines, the trains, the cars, the buses. There's no good way. That was like the original slide I remember Bill and I in my apartment trying to make and trying to like conceptualize the problem we're trying to solve. So you hit the nail right in the head.
So with the hydrofoil technology, these are, like you said, the surfboards that come up off the water a good, 3 feet. How does that work? It sounds like that's been evolving pretty quickly over the last few years since, I guess, Soviet era.
Hydrofoils are basically underwater wings. The nice thing is that water is about 1,000 times denser than air, so you can make the wings pretty small. But essentially, you have an underwater wing that's connected to your vehicle. The wing, essentially flies under the surface of the water, generates lift, and keeps your vehicle, a couple feet off the surface of the water. So waves, your hull does not touch the surface of the water. So waves or any surface, imperfections, I guess you can call them, pass right beneath you, and your ride is extremely smooth. And again, that technology has been around for a long time. There's old Navy ships that were experimenting with it. There's been ferries that have been trying to do this, but it's kind of the culminate, open water, they don't work very well because, if you're in the open ocean, there's really large waves and you can't have that clearance under your vehicle. So you need to be able to fly. So we're really trying to it's really kind of a puzzle piece of solving different problems for getting between two different coastal cities. In the harbor, you're really trying to deal with maritime traffic and be comfortable. In the open ocean, you're trying to be fast and safe. So the float foil fly mission is really catered to that, the real life operation that we imagine for the sea glider.
And this all ultimately evolved from the WIG, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the WIG stands for wing in ground or wing in ground effect. And as we were saying, that is that state, that sort of cushion of air, just like we see the birds flying on. Pelicans are birds in ground effect, right? So that is that vehicle technology. That's what the Russian Akronoplans were. They were sort of the first WIGs. But really, those and all WIGs since have had the same three problems. They have very poor wave tolerance because they take off and land on their hulls. And so, at best, that's an uncomfortable ride as you take off over waves. At worst, you can't fly at all. And so now I can't plan my vacation around this trip that may or may not be able to fly because the waves are too big that day. The second one, right? It's like if you're building
That's
a new
problem.
boat, yeah, it needs to be reliable, right? The second is poor harbor maneuverability. So these things take off and land like airplanes at 100 miles an hour or more, and they're very unmaneuverable while they do it. You look at how seaplanes operate, and they literally have stretches of water that are cleared to basically be their maritime runways, and so you can't have boats in that environment. But at least seaplanes can then fly above and exit the harbor. Wigs need to stay in that ground effect, and so now they're ripping through harbor over 100 miles an hour, not very maneuverable, and a liability to all the other traffic in the harbor. The fishermen and the tours and the cruises and the shipping vessels are not going to like that. And then finally, you have very poor safety records. While this ground effect is aerodynamically favorable, it's also aerodynamically unstable. And it's basically like asking the pilots of these vehicles to sort of hold the vehicle, 5, 10, 20 feet off the ground and just stick it there for hours. And so, those three factors in past human-flown, uncontrolled ground effect vehicles really made them commercially unviable. But now we can solve all those problems. Today, as Mike said, we have hydrofoils, which give us both wave tolerance and maneuverability in harbors, and then we can wrap the whole system with a digital flight control system, protect the flight envelope, and really reduce the operator workload significantly. The operators of these are going to be like maritime captains. They'll be able to control heading with the steering and throttle like a boat, and then all the other airplane stuff, your roll and your pitch and your altitude and your stability and wind gusts and waves, all that will be handled by the digital flight control system that our engineering team is working on.
So it sounds like in the past with these vehicles, you had to take off the water, which, if you have waves, that is going to be a very bumpy ride. And then the pilot had to sit there and make sure that you didn't crash the 6 feet into the water at any given time. And what you guys did is added hydrofoils, which are new, that allow you to taxi around essentially harbors and allow you to take off without having to, be actually cruising along the waves, which is going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of a fair summary here. And then, with the hydrofoils, and now that we're transitioning between these three different modes, that's what's led us sort of like, the Airbus model as compared to the Boeing model is more controls by the airplane, less on the pilot. We've taken one more leap even further in that direction, where now actually the controls the pilot has are less, and more is being handled by this automated flight control system, which therefore, imbues safety into the design, right? So we've taken one more step here and said, in the past, wigs have been dangerous because the pilot workload has been so high, but now we have flight control systems that are fully capable of handling these systems and doing it safely and reliably and controllably, day in and day out, day and night, in weather and in calm. So that's what we're putting into the system now, in addition to the hydrofoils.
It's felt like talking to some other founders in the space who are working on electric vehicles and just new types of aircraft, that aircraft design is pretty drastically changing in a way that it probably hasn't since the tube and wing model of modern planes was introduced. And I think a lot of that is because of electricity and electric propulsion. But I'm curious, given you guys work in the space, is that what it feels like for you working in it? And if so, why?
It's certainly changing because we have new tools in our belt. We have electric propulsion, where before, if you wanted propulsion, you needed this big, heavy, expensive turboprop or turbojet or turbofan engine, and you stick them on the airplane. You only need one or two, right? So you probably make them symmetric and stick one on each side. Not too many places to put it. You can put it under the wing, you can put it in the tail, and that's sort of it. And it turns out that the tube and wing is actually a very efficient design. A wing looks like this and it's straight. And how do we put people in an aerodynamic container? We wrap them in a tube and stick the two together, and there you go. So it's simple, it's lightweight. And that's why, since really the 1950s and sort of the advent of the turbojet, we've been flying turbojet powered tube and wings, with podded propulsors. Now we have new technology. We have electrification, which means we can put propulsion wherever we want it. And we put a motor there, and maybe we have a centralized battery, and we run some wires between them. It's very low weight to do so. the question, and now we also have more advanced structural technology, so we can make more intricate shapes. We're not working with aluminum anymore. We're working with carbon fiber, which is we can make more intricate designs. We can do more curves. We can think about how things warp under load, and so we can optimize them warped under load and then unwarp them when we build them, so they're perfectly made for their operating conditions. However, and sort of the caveat here is it's unclear that just throwing all this new technology into the space actually makes a difference because, as I said, a tube and wing is actually a really efficient and simple design. And so we see the world of eVTOL proliferating with all these really innovative, really integrated designs and configurations. And we're sticking propulsors all over the place and wings all over the place and people all over the place. And it sort of feels like this boom of innovation and technology. But, so I guess our question and sort of on the side of the boom, I think we're certainly part of the boom because we're putting these new technologies to work in a new way. But if you look at a sea glider, it's kind of a tube and wing concept, So we're sort of looking at the space a little bit on the sidelines and saying, well, these are first off, really cool and really innovative, but will any of them be better than the airplanes and helicopters that we have today? There's 100 years of history there. So it'll be really interesting to see how it shakes out.
And when you talk about being able to put propulsors anywhere, that's because fundamentally you don't have fuel tanks, which empty and then change the weight distribution, which is pretty important when you're flying a vehicle. And electricity doesn't weigh anything. Even if a battery is charged or not charged, it weighs the same amount. So you can move electricity along wires to anywhere, so you can kind of change the whole dynamic. And that's what you mean when you're getting at these systems that have 4 different wings or the 4 props, the vertical takeoff and landing, all the different kind of models that we're seeing now and the crazy kind of mock-ups of what could be some startups' new flagship aircraft.
Just about. It's less so the fuel than the propulsion itself. Like, how do you get a turning thing to the propeller that needs to turn? Right. So if we think about a conventionally powered aircraft with mechanical propulsion, there's really 2 ways you can do it. You can stick a turboprop or a turbofan anywhere. The 747 has 4 of them just spread out. They just, bolt them to the wing and there you go, distributed propulsion. You could have a central engine and then you could distribute that power through gearbox and shafts out to your propellers, right? So you have and this is why the helicopter companies make all their money. This is their moat. They are the best gearbox manufacturers on the planet. So you have an engine, a gearbox, shafts coming out of the gearboxes, more gearboxes that turns the shafts that then powers the propellers. And if you want to get really complicated, you build a V-22, which needs to be reliable and therefore fault tolerant, where you actually have 2 propellers, 2 engines, both of which have a gearbox and a cross shaft to the other engine, so the entire system could be powered in the event that either engine fails. Now, again, really cool mechanical system, but hugely expensive, very complicated, high part counts because you're doubling everything, have all these moving parts, so high maintenance cost, and you need to get really clever when you think about how to make these things redundant. Reliable. So now in our case, the freedom that we get is we say, where do we want propulsion? Okay, stick a motor there. We're going to have our central battery, which is actually sort of just like a central fuel tank, right? So the energy storage is not the key unlock here, but it's the energy distribution. How do we get our propulsive power to the propulsor? So now we can run wires from that central battery to the distributed motors. And then if we want to make it redundant, and I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but we run another wire to it, right?
Yeah.
And Bill, even tied to your last point too, we can build it into our optimization tools as well. So we can design our vehicle very efficiently. And then electric motors are very easy to customize and make different sizes and shapes, different, speed ranges and power ranges. So we can really cater, whereas in the old, traditional aerospace world, you say, hey, I'm going to put the, XYZ turbojet on my plane. And you kind of build around the size of the engine you have. We can very much cater the motors we put and where we put them to our optimized vehicle design.
Yeah, it feels like electric engines are just wildly more efficient than mechanical engines. I mean, you don't need like a drive shaft and a gearbox to spin a thing connected to an engine where you've got something exploding, a tiny little explosion creating mechanical force every few seconds.
I mean, the big thing is it's simple, right? It's super simple compared to turbojet engines. Their tolerances are so tight, like they're perfect, right? Electric motors are really a copper coil, magnets, and a spinning shaft and bearings. And that's what a huge piece for driving down maintenance costs, and why you see the electric aviation one of the largest cost drivers that of what we can reduce is the maintenance costs for the engines and the motor and the propulsion system.
Yeah, so I think that might be one of the most fascinating parts of the space is that in theory, all of these are way cheaper than their combustion alternatives. Like running an electric jet, if we got one of those, or an electric sea glider would be a lot cheaper than a traditional sea glider. Not that traditional sea gliders with hydrofoils exist, but you get where I'm going here.
Absolutely. It's really been our fundamental belief that while it is important to achieve our ESG goals and reduce emissions globally by getting new sustainable technologies, and in particular, sustainable transportation technologies into the world, that we can't get them into the world if we're selling sustainability for sustainability's sake. There are tax incentives and sort of ESG targets, but that's not going to cut it. So what we need to do is bring a new mode of transportation that fundamentally changes the game. It is the cheapest mode. It is the fastest mode. It is the most comfortable mode. It is just the best overall experience. And then say, oh, by the way, Mr. Airline, it's also zero emission, and you get that for free. And that's really how we're going to change the world here is bringing a vehicle that makes like real economic sense and then bringing along that sustainability advantage for free. Now, to your point on the cost reduction, the main decreases in cost reduction are one on the fuel side, that we can get electricity for less than fuel costs, and two, reduction in maintenance. So when we go back to thinking about those distributed propulsion systems with all these moving parts and gears and things that can break and go wrong and need to be lubricated, there's lots of maintenance involved in that. And actually, these engines need to get completely overhauled every period or so, every few years, which is like 50 to 80% of buying a new engine itself. So just hugely expensive maintenance costs. In our case, as Mike said, there's less moving parts. There's basically just motor bearings. And so you inspect the motor bearings and great, they're good to go. And then maybe, every decade or so you replace the motor entirely. We'll also have battery replacements. So every, say, 2,000 to 3,000 cycles, the batteries on our vehicles or on any vehicle are just like phone batteries. I mean, it's the same technology. So just like your phone battery ages over time and loses life, so too do electric vehicle batteries. So when we're planning their operations, we really need to plan them for the end of life when they might only have, 80% of their useful life left. And so, we will replace the batteries, and we're looking into sort of sustainable life cycles for how you'd use those batteries and recycle them. But even that is a maintenance event that happens on the order of once a year or once every other year, and is not a large part of vehicle costs. Those engine overhauls are really, really expensive.
Yeah, I just read an article a while back about how electric vehicles are going to put a good amount of mechanics out of work because you just don't need replacement parts. Like you just don't need to go in and have all these different parts replaced. There are fewer parts, which is sad for the mechanics, but good in the sense that, cars will be more durable, cheaper, cleaner. And the cleaner piece is one thing we haven't really talked about. That idea of making things cost effective and driving a real economic value is something that I always get most excited about. And we haven't talked about the clean aspect at all, which is almost obvious because it's electric. But at the same time, I imagine a lot of your electricity will be coming from the power grid, which is generated by whatever the city nearby is generating power with. So everything from coal to solar, depending on your wherever you land.
Exactly. And actually, as we look about other missions for this vehicle, so we spoke about commercial and tourism and cargo, but there's also some more civil government missions like Coast Guard, maritime patrol, sort of surveillance, threat detection at sea, disaster relief, right? And how do we get vehicles? Say, for example, there's an earthquake in an island nation. How do we get support and supplies and water and food there? If the airport is, unable to be landed at now, you need these runway independent vehicles with rapid response, and that's exactly what a sea glider can do. So when you think about it in that context, we see the world shifting towards this concept of resiliency, which is rather than having a fleet of gas-powered vehicles, and if I lose access to gas, I lose access to transportation, now you have electric vehicles, and so the advantage is not only they're electric, but they can be fueled by anything. An electric vehicle is the universal fuel because, as you said, you can power that grid with coal. You can power it with geothermal, you can power it with wind, you can power it with hydro, whatever you want. And so there's the advantage, obviously, in the long term and in the reduction of global emissions that we can move the grids globally towards sustainable end-to-end grids. But in the near term, we have this added benefit on these disaster relief, humanitarian, and coastal patrol missions of being resilient, of having complete flexibility in how we fuel the grid, because the grid can always fuel the electric vehicle.
I also wanted to ask you about the incumbents. So Boeing, Airbus, they're really the players in the aerospace market. And as you see all of these new startups pop up that are working on electric vehicles, Joby, a number of others, you guys, of course, and the traditional companies, I imagine, are still working in that direction. But do you think there's room for, more players to come into the market? Where do you think this will shake out over the next, 20, 40 years with these two major players and then, potentially this whole wave of new aircraft designers coming up underneath them?
Yeah, we have 100, 200 eVTOL advanced air mobility electric airplane companies in the world. There will certainly be consolidation. Not all of them will win the day. But when we look at how do vehicles work today? How do airplanes work? How do helicopters work? How do cars work? There are multiple winners, right? There's really no vehicle where there is one brand. You can buy the Boeing or Airbus or Bombardier or Embraer, right? You can buy a Ford or a GM or a Toyota or a Honda. So I would expect it to be the same here, and maybe we consolidate to 5 or so, plus or minus companies in each space. But we'd expect there to be, multiple eVTOLs, multiple eCTOLs, so electric conventional takeoff and landing, sort of off the runway and back. And there may even be some other seagliders. So we'll see.
Michael, what does it actually take to build one of these things? Because that's always a question I love to ask, whether I'm talking to like Peter Beck at Rocket Lab or Delian at Varda, and especially you being, kind of the core of the engineering team here. How do you build these types of things? And just what does it take?
It's a lot of very multidisciplinary engineering. We're solving a lot of hard problems. The physics of hydrofoil is extremely non-linear, and there's a lot of cool kind of nuanced pieces. You need experts in every kind of field that we're looking to innovate in. Like I mentioned, hydrofoils. Electric propulsion is new, and it's established, but it's still new. And having experts who understand how we build those motor systems, the propeller systems, to really take full advantage of those of this new technology. Battery technology, same thing. You need people who understand the chemistry. You can walk into a supplier and say, "Hey, I want to buy your batteries," but you really need someone who understands everything about the chemistry and what you're getting, cycle life, performance under different loads. It's really what surprised me over the course of the past year and a half we've been doing this is that it's so multidisciplinary that it's cool to see everyone's different experiences. It's really interesting to see the cross correlation of the maritime guys have really cool ideas that you look at and say this is super applicable and for something even aero related. So yeah, the one thing I'll leave you with is it's very multidisciplinary, and it really goes to the show that the marrying of the maritime world and the aircraft world it's awesome to see come together. That's my favorite part of Regent so far, on the technical side.
How do you break down like a product or a project like that into pieces that all of these different engineers across, a dozen different fields can work on? Like what is, top of mind for you right now as far as on the top of the to-do list that you have to get done this week, this quarter?
The way we break it down is really by taking it, it goes down to the original product market fit. Bill and I went through Y Combinator last winter, and they keep hammering on you need product market fit, right? And I'd like to say that everyone, my old view of a startup is, you have a startup company, you get to build cool stuff. But in reality, it's much different, right? And so what's cool, what's really exciting about my role is that I have to kind of bridge between what Billy's doing on the BD side and, talking to customers and working with these potential operators, understanding what their needs are and their concerns, and then bring those to the engineering team and saying, hey, like we need 12 seats in the first vehicle for this reason. And, there's a requirement that draws back to the operations side of things. We need different traffic detection and avoid systems because this is a major concern from our customers, how they're going to operate in these harbor and maritime environments. It's tying everything back to what the customer needs and how we're actually going to bring these to market. Because, if we can build a really cool vehicle that doesn't do anything for a customer, right? But we really want to make sure that this vehicle is very much key to the market we're trying to serve and will be successful when it first hits the dock and the first customer steps on board.
That's like a particularly hard thing to ask for your company, though, product market fit, because it's one thing for a Y Combinator company that's, building a product to build websites or even payments for e-commerce companies or something like that. Like you can build a wireframe. I could build a wireframe not knowing how to code using, an app online and show it to customers. You can't really put people in a seaglider and see how they feel about it until you have a seaglider that you've already put millions into to get it off the ground, literally.
That's why they call it hard tech. Yeah.
Well, I guess that leads into, from a hardware perspective, this is the type of industry that requires a lot of capital and has longer return timelines, potentially higher returns. That was another thing Delian Asparohov at Varda, or I guess at Founders Fund in that capacity, said when I was chatting with him, was that he thinks SaaS will maybe have higher revenues, but not the best returns in the future. The best returns will come from atoms and bits, so the combination of hardware and software, which it sounds like you have a lot of software involved, given that these planes can't really fly that well 6 feet above the ground without a very complicated flight system. But raising money and what you need for that over time. What is the next, few years of raises and rounds look like? And I guess that all gets back to the question of when can I actually get on it? You're going to have to scale a few of these before you're really doing frequent travel between New York City Harbor and Boston Harbor.
Yeah, well, without getting into sort of the exact numbers of it, we can sort of tell you how we're approaching it. In general, we're moving on a rapid prototyping schedule, and so we pace ourselves and align our raises with milestones. So right now, we're actually testing a quarter scale integrated seaglider prototype down in Tampa. So it has 18-foot wingspan. It's 400 pounds. This is a big machine, complicated, and it's really showing for the first time ever that we can do these transitions from float to foil to fly, and we can control them, and we know how they work, and we're ready to go scale to a full scale. So we'll have a raise before we go do that full scale, obviously, to fuel the development of that vehicle. We're targeting humans on a seaglider by the end of 23, and then working through that float foil fly over the first part of 24 there. So that will be really the first proof point of, we have a full-scale vehicle, the focus of which will be safety, right? So right now it's an unmanned vehicle. We're focusing on the physics and the operations. The full scale will be focused on safety, ensuring we have that safety so we can take human crew and passengers. From there, we'll do another raise, and then we will manufacture it, right? So we'll take our design learnings from the full-scale prototype, put them back into another design spiral, make sure we have the best product, make sure it's something that's designed designed for manufacture as opposed to designed for, hand layup and just a one-off. We'll spool up our low rate manufacture and our distribution, first nationally and then internationally, and get these vehicles to market by 2025. So we'll have, sort of a raise at each intermediate point to fuel the next stage. One of the great things about hardware as well, and something that is classic in both the maritime space with buying large ships and the airline space with buying new aircrafts, is this concept of letters of intent and then deposits on aircraft early to reserve delivery payments, and then pre-delivery payments that track to milestones like technical progress and first flight, to certification progress, to timeline progress. You pay a year before your delivery. So our contracts with our customers have all of these pieces built in, and so as we go deeper and we think about how to finance manufacture of aircraft, it's not just venture and equity models that we have as a tool in our tool belt to say we're going to sell a piece of the company to take on new capital to power this, but we'll now have firm contracts with money down and committed money going forward that match to each individual vehicle. And now we can actually start to leverage debt to go fuel this, because we can say, well, we have a contract, we know we're going to get paid, we just need the money to build it now, and we'll return more money when we get paid on the way. And so I think that's another great benefit of hardware, is that we can get some very high confidence contracts signed and probabilities that will convert on future orders with this sort of firm deposit and pre-delivery payment schedule. So
you're getting around the whole high upfront cost by literally making like a smaller one. Like instead of building a wireframe as a prototype that you can show customers, you're building one of these essentially in miniature, and then you'll build a fully scaled up one over time.
So miniatures, you can't call it miniature because it's big. It's about 18-foot wingspan and weighs 400 pounds. The subscale prototype is what you typically would do in the aerospace world. And it's really more of a the aerospace world traditionally is like a wind tunnel model, right? Where you see these old photos of these old guys with these wooden models in the wind tunnel. The float foil fly mission hasn't existed yet. So what we really wanted to be able to do with that prototype vehicle is to show that we can build a vehicle that does this float foil fly mission and let our investors and customers and really the world see what our vision is. And the reason why it had to be so big is what I went, go back to what I originally said about the density of water and the strange physics of hydrofoils. We really had to make it big enough where the hydrofoils were large enough and the wing was small enough to kind of marry the two sizing. I won't get too deep into that, but it was kind of, we had to make it that size to work with the physics. And the plus side is that it's a really big and cool vehicle to kind of look at and see, opposed to a lot of the traditional smaller subscale models that I would say are less exciting as like this large 18-foot wingspan flying machine, seaglider.
So you made it big enough that it follows all the physics your full-scale model will need, but at the same time, it's small enough, it's as cheap as you could get it while making it as small as possible for material costs and everything like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's wild. I imagine if you're in the space, that's an obvious way you prototype things, but speaking mostly to software companies, that's super interesting.
Well, there's always that tension of, how big do we go? How small do we go? What specifically are we trying to prove? Because this isn't the end vehicle. And so, we certainly had some feedback that said, well, just build the full scale thing the first time and prove everything all at once. And, to your point, Joe, that takes a lot of money. And we have people say, well, build a remote control version, build a little tiny version you could put on a table. And for a fraction of the money, you'll get it in the water and in the air in a quarter. And we started doing that and we're like, well, what are we actually getting out of this? We can do all this stuff, and the flight control system is not the novel part of this. So even if we put a cool flight control system on this remote control plane, we're not proving anything. Like, we know we can do that. That's implementation. The new thing we're trying to prove is float, foil, fly, and that we can control that and do that reliably. And so in order to do that, the absolute smallest, we can make the thing and still obey the physics and still be able to make the parts and not have the parts, like watchmaking here, is at the size we built.
Well, my last question for everybody on the show, because I know we're coming to the end here, is about your vision for the company. Where would you like to see Regent in 10 or even 20 years?
I want to see sea gliders everywhere. I want sea gliders to be a ubiquitous thing. I want them to be totally associated with these routes. You fly to Hawaii, you take sea gliders between the islands. The Boston-based schools, and Mike and I were at MIT, and it was just a pain to visit our friends in New York. Well, now you take the sea glider. I want to see cities start buying sea gliders, so it's not just a commercial operation, but maybe now instead of having a city-run bus line or a city-run train, you have city-run sea glider services. We want to see sea gliders in disaster relief support. We want to see sea gliders protecting our harbors and protecting our seas. There are so many missions out there where sea gliders can be of use, and really on that 10-year time horizon, we want the world's oceans and the world's coastal communities to just be covered and also quiet and low emission with these electric sea glider vehicles. So that is our vision, to really fundamentally change coastal transportation.
Yeah, that's an awesome vision. And I'm excited to take a sea glider. You'll have to let me know as soon as they're up and running. I would love to jump on one.
We'll do the next show on board.
That would be great.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been really fun and fascinating.
Appreciate it, Joe. Thanks so much for having us.